The lecture is called "You Cannot Hold Two Watermelons in One Hand." It comes from I did some field work in Pakistan and Afghanistan for this project, and I've been doing work there for the last 5 or 6 years. Originally, I went to Afghanistan in 1993 when I was a student, and it was a very, very different place at that time. And obviously, as you know, it's a completely different scenario currently, where lots of international actors are present, and also Afghan actors are present, and from Pakistan, and then we have the military who's there. So in all of that, how do we make sense of where do we really start discussing issues of gender justice? So the question I posed to one of the senior security advisor who was working with President Hamid Karzai at that time in 2009 is that how do you really combine issues of gender justice in your work in security? How do you talk about that? And he told me that, oh, Bina, we talk about gender, but it's not really like that. We have a saying in Dari, which is, you cannot hold two watermelons in one hand. Gender and security you cannot hold in one hand. So that's from that actually anecdote this title comes, that how do you really talk about two big watermelons in one hand. So in this lecture I'd start with several frameworks, but at the beginning I talk about religion and actually how we talk about religious identity politics through various frameworks. So in the context of, in religion, we have talked about as a central tenet of theological study, then religion and conflict, faith and peace building, but we do not actually know enough about how various security institutions and their negotiations with interest groups that employ specific kind of religious and traditional ideologies. The global war on terror has generated a scholarship that focuses extensively on extremist groups, the entrenched debates between fundamentalism and Islamism, and also fundamentalism and secularism. However, these discussions also either exclude women, except for their roles as mothers or suicide bombers, members of extremist groups themselves, and cultural bearers of their religion through clothing choices, or simply sometimes really try to talk about them through the gender mainstreaming agenda, but really don't know how to do that well on the ground. Let me show you some photographs. So we have these images of women, the veiled women being protected by women in power. Then we have various kinds of images where we sensationalize Muslim women and their identity in traditional societies. So all of these sort of dominate the discussions in the international literature, or even in various kinds of UN human rights meetings which try to bring local women, that women in Pakistan and Afghanistan are oppressed. Many times we really don't talk about how international humanitarian interventions themselves contribute to this kind of oppression, or contribute to certain kind of silencing that happens to women on the ground. So this is one thing I'm really interested in. And the other thing I'm really interested in is that how actually this whole concept of gender justice is really used on the ground in terms of law. Law is one area of my interest, where I see that how law actually sometimes is used to further oppress women in the name of security, and where also the issue of justice, the justice agenda, is sometimes compromised. So feminist scholars focusing on human rights have often used gender justice interchangeably with notions of gender equality, gender equity, women's empowerment, women's rights, and women's security. These have all sort of worked in the intersection of rights and development, and have often conceptualized gender justice as a process that requires women to ensure that power holders within the household, the community, the market, or the state can be held accountable for actions that limit women's access to resources, or capacity to make choices on the grounds of gender. And while there have been attempts to create solidarity in feminist spaces, we should also recognize that there are also many debates within feminist circles about many of these attempts as elitists, imperialists, or merely disconnected from the lives of many of the world's women. So I draw on two particular kind of theoretical framework. One is feminist insights and advocacy on identity, politics, and security, and the other is the peace, state, nation building literature. Through this, what I do is that first I sort of talk about how the pervasive militarization of some societies, here I am talking about Pakistan and Afghanistan, there is a muted identity or identities of Western and religious traditional forms of securitized behavior coexist. And these also reinforce gender biases. So as a result, what we see, for example, here in Pakistan, is some sort of balances of alliances, which I talk about as balance of the state security institutions with anti-state local security institutions. So I'm arguing that it's not really helpful to always talk about the Taliban as extremist institutions, because many of these institutions actually you cannot really, however you argue with them and however you negotiate, it's not possible to bring some of these groups in the traditional way states are built. And security sector is institutionalized, because many of these political groups may not even want a state. So these I talk about as anti-state local security institutions. And the second one is how top-level advocacy in international societies is actually often viewed as modern, secular, Western, and it's becoming more and more distant, despite the very good rhetoric on the top level that it has to be grounded on local level activism, that it's actually becoming more distant from what's happening on the ground. The example of that is in Afghanistan, where we see a very top-heavy gender mainstreaming agenda. By mainstreaming is that, very simply put, that gender should be actually introduced in every kinds of governance mechanisms of the state, that it does not necessarily actually ensure gender justice. So these are two of my main arguments. And here I also look at various kinds of international, the women, peace and security agenda. And I don't know if you're aware, but there was this UN Security Council Resolution 1325 adopted in 2000, which was groundbreaking in really responding to women's issues in conflict zones. So I talk about that, and also there were other resolutions which I have listed here, and many of you of course know about CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So Pakistan Pakistan signed CEDAW in 1996, and Afghanistan signed CEDAW in 2003. Neither of the countries have a national action plan on Security Council Resolution 1325, but in June 2013, last year, the government of Finland sort of approached Afghanistan to help it to develop its women, peace and security agenda. So that's where the countries stand at the moment. So the first example, what I want to give you is from Pakistan. Now, let me just skip some of this theory bit. The first case study of Pakistan, it is based on the premise that national identity and nation building are not given processes. Rather, they emerge through naturalized methods cultivated by various state institutions such as schooling, cultural practices, sports, religious ceremonies, and state rituals. So in Pakistan, what we see, that religious identity is very deeply embedded in Pakistan's national identity. I don't know if, can anyone tell me when Pakistan was created? Do you know about the whole history? Sorry? Yes, because that time India was partitioned. When the British left India, they partitioned it on the basis of religious identity. So Pakistan was created, and there was this distinct Islamic identity that was actually from the beginning of its statehood, we see had been critical to Pakistan's state building. So religion, as many of the scholars in 1979, for example, Asaf Hussain, who is a Pakistani scholar, he talked about it as a mullah military nexus. Mullah meaning the Islamic clerics of Pakistan. And he mentioned that how critical it was for the state, for example, to have a military, because that military was really important from the beginning. It always thought of India as the enemy, and this is of course mutually believed by the Indian state, and I'm not going to go into that now. But for the survival of the military, and here in different government times we see how actually Islamization, the politics of Islamization has been reinforced over and over again by the Pakistani military at that time. And so here he talks about that the mullah military nexus have been very important for Pakistani statehood from the beginning. Now, why is this very important? So this is Pakistan. So just northern Peshawar is the Fatah region, which is federally administered tribal areas. Many of these areas are extremely inaccessible to people, and foreigners are not allowed to actually also go there without any permission or without the military's support. And also some of the international forces and for example the UN also don't really work from the areas outside Peshawar. So those areas are extremely inaccessible, and some of those areas we see the Pakistani Taliban working. Now Pakistani Taliban is quite different from the Afghan Taliban, and many of them meaning they are very well versed in Pashto, Urdu and also English. So they actually follow the newspapers a lot and see what's happening everywhere. So it's not that they are very uneducated and just simply following some sort of ideology. Very much contrary to that, they're very much well versed in the international politics, many of them, as I found. So the Pakistani Taliban, which is most infamously known for its work or its attack on Malala Yousafzai in October 2012, primarily because this guy Maulana Sufi Muhammad, who you see on my right, so your left, he founded this group called Movement for the Enforcement of Mohammedan Law, TNSM, and his son-in-law, Maulana Fazlullah, who later became a leader, and he ordered the assassination of Malala Yousafzai. So there are other groups also which operate with them, Lashkar-e-Taiba and then Tehrik-e-Taliban, which is TTP, and so all of them actually together formed an alliance there, and several times with drone attack, several of the Taliban leaders were killed. I won't bore you with the details, but at the moment Hakimatullah Masood is the current leader of this alliance, and Maulana Fazlullah, who you see here, the younger guy, he is called Radio Mullah. The reason he's called Radio Mullah is that he had quite a lot of radio stations where the programs were actually fascinating to hear. He talked about how anti-polio drops was a mission of the Western world to control reproductive capacity of the Muslims. Then he talked about how education is very problematic of girls. So these programs were hugely popular at one time, at least between 2009 to 2011. And after that, the Pakistani government closed down some of those programs. So what happened is that while their programs were really problematic, what they did is that the war-weary Pakistani army in 2009 ended up signing a deal with them that close to Peshawar in Malakand division, they were actually able to establish Sharia law. And this law, and then Pakistan promulgated the Nizam-e-Adl law in 2009, in which it meant that in Swat Valley area, I'll go back to the map again, close to Peshawar, in that area, not in Peshawar, outside Peshawar, actually in that area, and in Fatah, the Sharia law was actually, it was promulgated as Sharia law for peace deal. In that, what it meant that many of the schools in that area in 2009 were closed down after that. And also many of the anti-polio drops program were also stopped in those areas. So when I was interviewing many of the humanitarian actors who work there, they mentioned that, look, we have to actually have some sort of deal with these groups because we need peace in that area. And that peace meant that we have to have some sort of, we can't really think about gender at this point. We will come to this later. We'll come to this later when peace would be, when the state would be built. So that way actually many of the humanitarian actors, local actors and also international actors, actually separated the issues of gender equality and gender justice from the larger, peace project, if you like, in that area. And all of this was happening at a time when in 2009, at that time, there was a 17-year-old girl, Chad Bibi. She was flogged and then she died. So this case through social media was widely publicized, and there was this conversation that Pakistani Taliban is really barbaric, and look how the military and the Pakistani government is having these deals with these groups and having the Sharia law. So when that was happening, I will give you an example. This was a different one. And this happened, some of you would know about Mukhtar and Mai, who was gang raped by her local community, and after in this local kind of arbitration. So when that happened, they were always talking about that NGOs always use the cases of violence against women to really just make it very much a sensitive issue, whereas it's not. And NGOs and other sort of local groups, especially women's groups, are really always against peace in Pakistan. So that rhetoric is very present, very much present. During Chad Bibi's flogging case, what President Asif Zardari mentioned was that many of the NGOs don't understand that for peace we sometimes have to compromise various kinds of local issues, such as women being flogged. So this was very much a rhetoric at that time that was present there. So this is what I argue about, that these groups, the military as a formal security institution and the government really have these deals with these anti-state security institutions, and they both compromise in the name of peace and name of justice. They compromise women's issue, but in the long run actually it does not serve any purpose of the state and of women's rights. So some of these photographs you see, women actually, various kinds of women's movements from Pakistan have really tried to counter these attacks from the top. There were many demonstrations in different times, and they talked about that women are not actually meant to be inferior, but a lot of this activism had to take place because many of these discussions were happening within the discussion of religious identity politics. So many times it actually, women's groups, what they had to do is that interpret texts in a way that had been really useful to discuss that, look, in the Quran and in the Hadith, it's not women are marginalized. Women are actually equal actors, but how do you really make that important connection of women and women's rights and religious texts to contemporary security agenda had been a continuing challenge as well for women's groups in Pakistan. The second example for Pakistan is actually about minorities. So I'm not sure if you're aware about the blasphemy law in Pakistan, but many times you may have heard it, you may have read about it in US newspapers. The blasphemy law, it's actually in the penal code, in the criminal justice penal code in Pakistan, which mentions that, if any of the major religion is attacked by any groups or individual, they could be punished, and that there could also be capital punishment. So it's a huge issue, and many times this blasphemy law has been used to really actually benefit particular groups. It's not that it has happened, it's not that the Quran has been burnt, but many times that excuse has been used to actually, for example, take lands from minorities, or for example, if there were questions of marrying a girl from a minority group, whereas the family is not agreeing, then maybe another guy who is from a powerful family, he could use the blasphemy law and drive that family out of a village. So all this way blasphemy law has been used in Pakistan. So in 2014, as of November 1, 2014, from the Pakistan Human Rights Commission, the number is that there were more than actually 67 deaths, blasphemy law, including of one child who had Down syndrome. And actually 2 days ago, a couple in Pakistan was also burnt, a Christian couple was burnt alive. That happened 2 days ago in Pakistan. So what's happening is that these strict blasphemy laws have often been also used by local, extremist, anti-state institutions, and also local communities who actually hide behind these blasphemy laws to grab lands of minorities. Before the war on terror, we have seen many times Pakistani academics and Pakistani activists really talking about that and taking up those issues. But what happened with the global war on terror discourse is that now many of these issues have been internalized. We don't hear, unless something extreme like that couple who was burnt alive 2 days ago, we don't hear any more about these issues of minorities, how minorities are forced to leave Pakistan and what's happening, and how different schools, this is a school in Farooqi school where girls have actually are protesting because the school was closed for more than 9 months, and this is a protest from, actually this is from 2012, it was at that time closed for 9 months. And here you see that different times actually groups come forward to talk about blasphemy laws and the persecution of minority communities. And also we have seen two of the very senior, one governor and one minister who was against blasphemy law, both were killed. And those killers were also celebrated in Pakistan. But in all of these cases, what we see is that Pakistani government have really raised its voice or really tried to control many of these elements. And there also we see that this whole issue is very much linked to this big thing about where Pakistan is in the global war on terror agenda and how it is actually controlling its own local problems. And in all of those layers, in all of those hierarchies of security issues, minority security don't at all get priority. And often here also, and I didn't talk about that, often you see that minority women have been severely victimized. But in any of the international, for example, the UN Women work, the recent report actually don't at all talk about minority women or minority children, how they're being affected, but really flatten all the issues of all women's security. And so I actually also think there's a problem there. So the other example I'd give you is from Afghanistan. Now in Afghanistan, the problem is a bit different. It's sort of gender justice has become a hostage of geopolitics of Afghanistan. As you know, it has been a battleground for several intrastate and international conflicts, including the Cold War and the global war on terror. Then with all this, the Afghan socio-political infrastructure has been deeply affected. Now while the Afghan public generally welcomed the US-led international military intervention that ousted the Taliban regime, the peace building and state building of Afghanistan has not been successful. So following the Bonn process, what we've seen, and there, I'm not going to read all these things, but these were some of the issues which are related to Afghan women's justice, which we've seen in the Bonn process. So in 2001, that talked about a roadmap of Afghanistan state building, and there were sort of several key benchmarks that were set to establish key institutions. For example, what would it mean to build a democratic Afghanistan? Now, this is where I didn't really talk about my theoretical part, but it's very important for you in your future work to really think about, because if you think about three big frameworks, one is state building, one is peace building, and one is nation building. So the peace building work, which is often discussed in UN literature, when it often talks about that in the aftermath of a conflict, or sometimes scholars and practitioners talk about it as post-conflict, sometimes it's talked about as countries in transition. So in that kind of time, peace building sort of assumes, UN often leads the peace building missions, that would help the local governance systems to be stronger. So peace building in that way would look at, for example, issues of justice, one of my work in war crimes tribunals, reconciliation. It would talk about, strengthening legal institutions and all those, or even actually building hospitals, schools, constructing roads. All of that would sort of fit into that. Now, United States, where we are at the moment, it talks about state building and nation building as one kind of framework. So in the United States concept, the way United States thinks about state building is that when there's war, when the state system collapses, when the external troops go in, so the way it helps the state to actually sort of assume the state sort of is built in a particular way that these foreign troops can exit. So in the way, a lot of discussion here in the US at the moment is how the US troops can in different times exit from Afghanistan. So as such, what the US troops would do as state building is that they would train local military, they would strengthen local police, they would be involved in lots of training. So they talk about it in terms of capacity building. Does it make sense what I'm saying as state building? Now, scholars and practitioners outside the US don't actually understand state building in this way. So they separate, and this is where I also come in, I would like to separate it from nation building, because state is sort of a structure. If you think about a very basic first year political science lecture, a state would have sovereignty, it would have citizens, it would have a territory, it would have a government. But nation is more than that. Nation you cannot actually control within a state, it can go beyond a state. Like there are Pashtuns in Afghanistan and Pakistan. They don't belong only to Afghanistan, they don't belong only to Pakistan. The Pashtun nation actually straddles in both places. And then there are other people who think about nation in terms of political community. A language could make a nation. Shared myth, shared symbol, the idea of how you think about quote-unquote motherland. So all these actually build nations. So outside the United States, there's this idea that nation building is much more of an organic process, and it takes a long time to build a nation. So if you separate nation building and state building and peace building in such way, of course these are not very simplistic processes the way I'm trying to make it. I'm just trying to give you a very simple version of very complex, ways of trying to help us state move towards democratization. But in terms of what happened in Afghanistan, and even now what's happening is that this state building, nation building, peace building agenda are all sort of in conflicting ways operating on the ground. The US troops and the US actors understand it in one way, so they have a very service delivery approach. Then the locals, they understand it in one way. They have a different way of thinking about, but because of donors and connection with the US and other international donors, they also look at it as a capacity building service delivery approach. And then you have local groups, the community groups, women's rights groups, minority groups, environmental pressure groups, refugee groups, individuals who think about it in a different way. They think about it as a very long-term process. Sometimes there'd be failures, sometimes there'd be success. So it creates a lot of tension within the ground about how to actually really think about humanitarian intervention and how to actually make it work on the ground. Because originally in Afghanistan, there were lots of hope that the foreign troops are coming and there'd be some sort of independence from the oppression what Afghan people were facing, especially Afghan women. But what happened is that with so much negotiations happening, and especially at this time that the foreign troops have to exit, some of those hopes were shattered and many compromises were happening, and some of those involved directly women's issues. So number one of that was that in 2004, the Afghan new constitution was actually, that was taken into the parliament. So what the Afghan constitution had done, the constitution, it talked about actually the lower parliament and upper parliament, the Walisi Jirga, which is the lower house of the parliament, and there was 25% quota of women. At that time there were reserve seats. And the Mesharano Jirga is the upper parliament, there was 17% quota was, and that was established. And then women are also given the right to vote in election, and the Ministry of Women's Affairs was also established at that time. So what happened is that you can recognize probably President Hamid Karzai, and what happened is that he had entered into in lot of negotiations with different warlords and also the Shia groups there, and eventually lowered in 2013. Both of these quotas have been lowered, and now in the lower house it's 20%, and in the upper house it's only 10%. And even that is sometimes very difficult to fill in, because many times women parliamentarians have been attacked and killed. So they have also been subjected to threats, and also the male legislators have also threatened them and insulted them in many ways. Government officials, I've interviewed quite a few of the parliamentarians. What they've said is that when they go to government offices to talk about various kinds of women's rights and issues, they're often insulted even by junior government officials. So it has been it's been very difficult to even actually start any sort of negotiations of one's women's rights. This guy on the right here, who was Ayatollah Muhammad Asif Mohseni, there was a controversial rape law that in 2009 was actually it was originally, it was passed by the lower house. So they were really advocating that. And because of the whole of the election compromises, President Hamid Karzai also supported that at that time. And the international organizations were all very much quiet. And at the end, what happened is that some of the Afghan women's groups approached Hillary Clinton to really step in and also bargain with them, and really approach all the male parliamentarians. So what we've seen is that there was a halt on that after that. And at the moment, there is also Elimination of Violence Against Women Act, which have been passed by the parliament, but President Hamid Karzai has again placed actually a halt on that. So it's not actually also operating on the ground. And on the other hand, you have this rhetoric that the Afghan National Police, the top one is actually from Pakistan, that's Pakistani police. I'll jump from that because of I don't have enough time. But you see below the Afghan National Police, there's women's wing. So what UN Women had done is that it talked about recruiting and training 5,000 Afghan women to serve in the police force, especially who would work in areas of domestic violence and sexual abuse and various kinds of issues. Again, what we have seen is that this has been done without actually understanding the local context, whereas it had been also anyway difficult for women to go and even to work as teachers or health workers. Serving in the police force is sometimes even considered more shameful to work with the local police. At least 4 of the senior Afghan female police officers have been killed over the last 2 years. And despite the whole rhetoric that 5,000 women would be trained, at the moment the number is only 1,200. So we see that when there are various kinds of international reports, these international and local top-down approaches don't really sort of engage with sometimes the local reality. So we see that this issue that yes, we are doing this thing, yes, we are training women, yes, they're involved, but if you look at the ground, the situation is much more complex. And I also again interviewed some of the women police officers who have mentioned that at the end what they do is just make tea for their male colleagues. They're not at all involved in any policing activity. So that also creates a different kind of tension about what we know is happening, about the empowerment agenda actually, and how it's operating on the ground. So finally, the last point I wanted to make is that in Pakistan and Afghanistan, the implementation and delivery of gender justice often relies on local elites who are actually part of the problem. While the international state building, nation building agenda necessitates engagement and dialogue with these local elites, these are exactly the individuals who are complicit in various injustices that communities, especially women, experience every day. The nation building processes have always also subsumed women's identity for the broader purposes of the nation. So sandwiched between these two, women often become the battleground for various kind of humanitarian intervention and ideological warfare. Thank you.